Queste cose lì in cielo cosa sono, ragazzi?
In 2011, I went to the province of Naples to investigate. The precise location, I think, was Gianturco, near Naples. Some young people said that they had seen a luminous being in a public garden. I went there the next day. I brought my Geiger counter with me and I interviewed them, and they confirmed to me that they had seen this strange luminous being from afar. In fact, they were very scared. I measured the radioactivity there, and suddenly the Geiger counter skyrocketed, then immediately afterwards dropped again. We can have some difficulties when we dialogue through the media, therefore on a platform, or not in the presence with the person who testifies. Because we do not have a valid method or the time to be able to fully understand if we have an incorrect predisposition regarding past and present life experiences. Predisposition has various facets in terms of interpretation. I'll concentrate on what concerns us. Therefore, predisposition means, more specifically, a pre-emotion, an antecedent emotional or cognitive disposition to what the person is experiencing in the here and now. During the pandemic, we have certainly recorded an increase in the number of sightings. There have been many people who have made reports of sightings to us, and this is also explainable because unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we all had to stay at home. And people who were lucky enough to have balconies or to have gardens obviously had more possibilities of looking up to the sky. Predisposition in the healthcare field, unfortunately, is often referred to quite profound pathologies, and therefore also from a cognitive point of view one goes to evaluate, as I mentioned previously, any problems related to psychosis or even schizophrenia. Therefore, predisposition in terms of medical history is important. If we want to address the question for a moment relating to history going back in time, it brings us back to sightings regarding experiences, be they direct or otherwise. There are authors who have written 2 or 3 volumes reporting these episodes, infinite episodes that occurred in our terrestrial history, going backwards in time. In my feedback, of course, I have tried to highlight these periods, starting from the present day and going back in time, the Middle Ages, after Christ, before Christ, and so on, up to those possibilities. Even some scientists talk about 200,000 years ago, as well as 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Let's start with our era. 1977. This may sound like science fiction, but it is a fact that during that night a very large object in the shape of a pink jellyfish appeared in the sky, which gave off a very intense light that illuminated the whole city, and it woke up the sleeping 300,000 inhabitants who were terrified. The strange thing was that opening the windows the next morning, the inhabitants found all the glass panes had many small holes in them, Professor Siegel mentioned a fleet because it seemed impossible that a single object, moreover light alone, could pierce the glass windows of the whole city. And 3 Soviet scientists gave their opinion, consolidating the hypothesis that it was a UFO, perhaps a fleet of them. An intelligence superior to our own is watching us for unknown reasons. There is another case. Going back in time, a simple, much discussed case that happened in 1969, just before Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, stepping out of Apollo 11. Incidentally, we can also say that the presence of men on the moon is a discussed fact, that man has never set foot on the moon, but let's leave this absurd assumption to one side. Armstrong claims in his diary that 2 UFOs passed over my head, and his partner, Buzz Aldrin, took several snapshots of them. But that's not all. Of course, with the potential we have to move out of the Earth's orbit, as we move towards infinity with our modern-day large telescopes, it is clear that probabilities increase. Probabilities that have been confirmed by so many military aircraft of the latest generation. That, through their radars, they describe very, very impossible to imagine situations of unconventional objects. So, in the modern era, we can say that there are technological means that lead us into this situation. Many say that clippeology and ancient archaeology end where the Roswell incident begins, where modern ufology conventionally begins. What happened in Roswell? On July 2nd, 1947, an object fell from the sky. After a few days, a local newspaper came out with headlines saying that a flying saucer had crashed. And this declaration was not made by just anyone. It was made by the American military themselves. Since there had been various witnesses, they realized that they had exceeded a certain limit. So the US authorities immediately retracted this version, saying, "Oh look, it wasn't, we were wrong. It wasn't a flying saucer, but it was a Project Mogul weather balloon." An American soldier took a photograph of himself, surrounded by lots of wreckage, and this photograph was circulated in order to deny the incident. Obviously, there were many witnesses, who were silenced in one way or another, not in the sense that they were harmed. However, with various unorthodox methods, they were told to keep their mouths shut, and this is strange in itself. Why would witnesses have to keep quiet if it was just a weather balloon? It was then understood that the UFO phenomenon was actually a delicate phenomenon, and therefore various projects began from 1947 onwards. Project Twinkle, Project Grudge, and everything then resulted in Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book started precisely in 1947, and this project lasted for more than 20 years, ending in 1969 with the Condon Report. So, what happened? Gradually, the testimonies increased, and we are still talking about the 40s. The most amazing UFO sighting of the past is dated April the 14th, 1561 in Nuremberg, where numerous witnesses saw several thousand flying objects of various shapes, lances, crosses, spindles, fighting an apocalyptic battle. Now, if we think about these episodes where many people witness the sightings, then it would more likely confirm the event and give it more reliability, with respect to a single observer. In 1952, there was an important incident. There were UFOs flying over the Capitol, in a nutshell, above the seat of the US Parliament. Since there were so many unidentified flying objects, fighter jets were even sent to intercept them, but they failed. They were unable to intercept them. So obviously, this created a climate of fear. The American people were very concerned. The population was worried, asking, what are these objects flying above our heads? Especially because the memory of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which took place a few years earlier, was still in their minds. Yes, the war was over. However, there was fear, perhaps that some foreign power had aircraft with absolutely futuristic performances. Let's head to the year 950 AD. There are, dare I say, in history millions of episodes, but these ones are truly incredible. The miracle of Cloera in Ireland. This is a nice incident. Legend has it that a miracle took place in the small town of Cloera. One Sunday, while the inhabitants were at Mass, a large metal anchor attached to a cable descended from the sky. One of the arms, equipped with a very large hook, stuck in the wooden post of the church door. The faithful rushed out and saw at the other end of the cable, in the sky, a ship that seemed to float on an imaginary ocean. Among other things, an episode like this Irish one also happened elsewhere, in France, where, alas, the flying object, having landed, was attacked and destroyed by terrestrials. At the beginning of January 1953, the so-called Robertson panel was formed, therefore a commission chaired by the physicist Howard Robertson. And what did this commission do in the end? Well, this commission came up with a report that was aimed at, let's say, debunking the UFO phenomenon by saying the UFO phenomenon is not a concern. Very often they are just planets, they are planes, they are natural phenomena. Indeed, the big problem is not UFOs. The big problem is mass hysteria, because foreign powers could take advantage of it to wreak havoc in the United States. Today's ufologists argue, such as Raymond Drake for example, that the period of the Middle Ages was one of the richest periods for extraterrestrial apparitions, and hundreds of them occurred. So, that these hypothetical extraterrestrial civilizations know us very well, and for so many reasons, causes and motivations that I cannot list, because they do not provide correct scientific documentation. However, from the beginning of time, these extraterrestrial civilizations cannot but know us very well. According to reports, the President of the United States in 1947 sent a letter to a certain Forrestal and said to him, "Look, let's create the Majestic 12 group." There were many members of this group, so there were several from the military, obviously, including, we can remember, Lloyd Berkner, or Donald Menzel. Donald Menzel was a famous astronomer, famous in those years because he officially declared himself against the UFO phenomena. He said, "No, it's not true, it's all nonsense." But it seems strange that while he publicly says one thing, he was part of a study group, such as Majestic 12, which specifically studied unidentified flying objects. This Majestic 12 group obviously also drew its own conclusions, trying to highlight that the UFO phenomenon was nothing relevant. Even these private groups themselves had to be kept under control. They had to be kept under control because they could be a problem for national security. Obviously, the American citizens had to be reassured. But why? Because the citizens, seeing these objects flying in the skies of the United States, did not feel safe, because they said, how can the state fail to control our airspace? And therefore there was this fear. There was also the problem that the United States obviously couldn't control the skies all around the world, because news of lots of sightings, in the meantime, came to light. The government of the United States tried to get out of this situation. So, what did it do? At the end of the 60s, in 1969, it wanted to end Project Blue Book, where 701 sightings out of the 12,000 plus had remained unexplained and were unexplainable. However, they placed their emphasis, in order to reduce the phenomenon, only on the explicable sightings. They said, look, they are all explainable. The others they ignored and didn't really take them into consideration. And this was discovered several years later. Because, bear in mind, Project Blue Book ended in 1969, and all these sightings were declassified several decades later, so this speaks volumes about the phenomenon. The Condom report said in 1969, this physicist, this commission, looking at the UFO phenomenon, said it's nothing relevant, there are no problems, there's no danger. It was said that there were no more secret investigations. However, this isn't true, because we have seen that the AATIP program actually continued these investigations, albeit in secret, probably so as not to unnerve the population. So, if it was nothing, if the UFO phenomenon isn't real, it's just mass hysteria, it's the planets, Venus, planes, etc., why continue these investigations? Positive or negative? Let's say that, from what has been said, analysing the pros and cons and giving some statistical hypotheses, the contact will certainly be positive. Because if they decide to contact us, it means that we are ready to be able to interact, or at least to listen more than interact. At the same time, if there is contact, it's because any malicious civilizations are no longer in the position or have the means to cause trouble. So if contact does take place, this means that there is an evolved civilization. It may also be civilization number one, which has always followed the planet Earth, that intends to put us into contact. As I said earlier, there are many hypotheses, but I don't think that contact will happen anytime soon. A contact, let's say an extended contact, before at least 200 to 300 years. While this hypothesized contact, already demonstrated by many research projects, this contact has already occurred with some of the authorities in charge. We are trying, above all from an official point of view, to find the aliens with the signals that we launch into space, and this could seem like a contradiction. I mean, on the one hand, the conspiracy theorists say that the government, the world's governments, have a kind of agreement with the aliens. The famous Holloman landing of the early 70s in the United States is said to have been a meeting between the government and the aliens. It was even said that a flying saucer had landed, but obviously this is difficult to prove. On the other hand, however, signals are sent into space. However, first of all, some researchers have said that it is very dangerous to launch signals into space, because we could reveal our presence to hostile aliens, so they could divide up the Earth and maybe they come to colonize us, and this is a fear of many scholars. However, on the other hand, it is also true that having a dialogue with nearby stars is very, very difficult, because we must keep in mind that the closest star is about 5 light years away, which means that light takes 5 years to arrive. Since the signals travel at the speed of light, when we launch them, it takes them 5 years to arrive. To get an answer would take another 5 years. But it is said, except for some suspicious signals, and also in this case I suspect that the authorities are not telling us the whole truth, it's been said that we have not received any replies. Besides, who said that aliens have to communicate through these type of signals that we send? As far as the so-called UFO crashes, alien incidents are concerned, The contactees very often claim these people who have somehow had to deal with these entities to have had a telepathic contact. Now, obviously having a telepathic contact cannot be excluded a priori, because perhaps we have these abilities, but we have not developed them over time, because we have language and other ways of communicating. Then there is a phenomenology, that is, of contacteeism, which is very, very frequent, at least as far as sincere testimonies are concerned. And through this phenomenon, there is a whole story that repeats itself, and many declare that they have been contacted in this way. Then we should go and establish what we mean once the terrestrial is contacted, and what the modalities are, if not those from, in quotation marks, a telepathic point of view. And the problem with telepathy is that we ask ourselves, where does the message come from and where does it go? So since they are two completely different parameters, the one that has the logical thinking power that can contact the other is the extraterrestrial. The terrestrial probably doesn't have this power. There are various episodes that can fully testify to this fact of telepathic communication. On the other hand, how else could they make contact? It is probable that there have been episodes of direct contact and close encounters, and there was this person, this quite elderly lady in the 1930s, who declared that she felt in her mind these contacts from an entity, from a civilization rather than an entity, but from representatives of, they declared themselves representatives of a civilization far from Earth. But apart from the ways we mentioned earlier, for those who sent the message to make themselves understood, was that the lady, for example, asked how long was their life on Earth? Was it 60 to 70, 90 years? And they were very precise in answering. Here we live much longer because we have the possibility and the potential to change, to replace our organic systems. At the time, this may seem absurd. It may have seemed absurd. But we must say that in hindsight, going back to the 60s for example, with the intervention of the heart replacement surgery by Dr. Barnard in 1967, we can have in hindsight the certainty that telepathy could be realistic, the content of the contact that this lady had had. The episode of this lady happened 40 years earlier, so there's no suspicion that Barnard's transplant occurred first and then they fabricated this story. The episode was very striking and supported in the previous decades, and this is a very linear episode of contacteeism. It is different from that of Siragusa, Eugenio Siragusa, or of Bon Giovanni, who have studied these phenomena and who claim to be contactees. So much so that they gave great witness accounts that we have to consider hypothetical, because they didn't introduce us to their extraterrestrials. We are materialists, and we must remain so. However, if we wanted to analyze the content, the exemplary life of Eugenio Siragusa, we will establish that he certainly had some, let's say, contact with extra-evolved civilizations. And that same evolution of intelligence presupposes the sense of brotherhood, the sense of solidarity, the sense of peace. The friendship case, like all, alas, all cases involving ufology, including sightings, is a rather controversial ufological saga. How did the friendship case come to life? The friendship case aliens are named V56, after the year they came to Earth. These aliens made contact with a group of people. They were philosophers. They contacted various categories of people. This story went on for several years. In fact, there is a book about this case written by an engineer, Stefano Breccia, a very serious person who has had contact with some exponents of the friendship case, such as Bruno Samaciccio. Bruno Samaciccio is considered to be the person of reference of this friendship case. The story began in Ascoli Piceno, and it went on for several years, especially on the Adriatic Sea. We must bear in mind that even journalists were involved. There are photos from the time of flying saucers that were taken, of course, and it was said that there were bases at the bottom of the Adriatic Sea. And in fact, from 1978 to 81, there was the famous case of Pier Fortunato Zanfretta, which is perhaps intertwined with this friendship case, because it was precisely in those years that the story of this night watchman took place, who said he saw a huge alien. The whole story is too long to talk about right now, but in those exact years, 1978 to 81, fishermen were afraid to go fishing in the Adriatic Sea, so fishermen who knew that coastal area. But why? Because they saw objects flying out of the water at absurd speeds, columns of water rising and objects submerging. Some exponents of the friendship case, but also the book by Stefano Breccia, mention a war between these V56s, who would be the good aliens, with the so-called CTRs, which was a hostile faction of aliens which was against these V56s. Those who were contacted by these V56 aliens, the good aliens, claim that they had bases under the Adriatic Sea, and some think, some believe, that there was this war between the good aliens and the bad aliens in the depths of the Adriatic Sea. I also spoke about these things with Gaspare De Lama, who is over 100 years old. He has a truly remarkable longevity, and he is one of the protagonists of the friendship case. And he told me this: "Angelo, by now I haven't got long left to live." But he's been saying that for the last 10 years. Not long left. So what's the point of telling you lies? It's all true. I haven't earned a single euro from this whole affair. They have brought a message of peace. With the increase in levels of intelligence and technology, society should improve. At least this is what the episodes of Extraterrestrials tell us, through contacts, sightings and communications, and also through the tales told by monotheistic religions. Therefore, also the episode of Eugenio Siragusa could be a testimony of contact. So what is this reverse engineering? It is, let's say, the practice of studying an object through its structure, its functioning and its operation in order to draw practical applications from it. Simply put, as far as UFOs are concerned, this technology is said to be copied from these UFOs that have crashed. This trend of ufology began its course starting from the Roswell incident, though some say it even dates back to the RS-33 cabinet. In fact, it is said that in the fascist era, a UFO crashed in Italy and was passed on to the Nazis, and the Nazis would have started to study this technology from the crashed flying saucers. Now, where's the problem with all this? Many ufologists say that all the amazing technological development that has taken place in recent decades would confirm this, because, as many scholars say, in the last 40, 50, maybe even 60 years, there has been technological development, truly sensational technological development. Because we passed, first from the birth of television, the cathode tube television, which was the ancient television from the 50s and even before. Then there was the transistor, integrated circuits, truly remarkable technological developments. We now have smartphones, which can be held in one hand, and no one would have ever thought just a few years ago that we would have televisions, practically portable televisions, and be able to communicate instantly with other people in other parts of the world. Even Philip Corso, who was a soldier in the United States of America Army, said he had seen the material from crashed objects, the so-called UFO crashes, taken to American military bases, where he has been, and he says that he has seen the development of these modern technological devices through the copying of this alien technology. From my point of view, it may well be that there is some influence from this recovered technology, but let's keep in mind, if we take, as we said before, such a complex flying saucer, such an evolved alien spacecraft, how do we understand how it works? Very often there are no buttons or locks or keys, they are completely closed. It would be like placing an atomic submarine in the hands of a man from 100, 150 years ago. Obviously, he wouldn't even know where to start. That is why I have my doubts about this reverse engineering. There is probably some truth to it, in the sense that we have had technological developments. However, from this to understanding the functioning of these unidentified flying objects is a large step. Otherwise, we ourselves would be much more advanced with our own technology, unless, as is often said, the military, who are always 30, 40 years ahead in technological development, are keeping these studies and these discoveries secret. Many scientists, including Margherita Hack, Piero Angela, CICAP, say that the distances between the stars are immense. It isn't possible for a civilization to reach the Earth, because it would be necessary to exceed the speed of light. To understand this, the speed of light is that for which, if a spacecraft hypothetically left the Earth now, it would take a second to get to the Moon. So you can understand how absurd this is. But we are reasoning according to our current degree of development. Nothing prevents a civilization that has 1,000, 100,000, 1 million or even 1 billion years of evolution, and perhaps an intelligence quotient which instead of that of the Earth is 3 or 4 times more evolved, from having built ships capable of crossing time and space. Evidently these aliens, these hypothetical extraterrestrial beings, have surpassed the laws of physics and are capable perhaps of even travelling between dimensions. Fortunately, we've had an evolution, at least as far as technology is concerned, which has enabled us to improve our lifestyle, to improve the content of our discussions, and therefore evolution goes forward, for better or worse, but it goes forward. So there is the risk of conflicts, of wars, and there always will be, with the increase not only of technology, but also of the so-called intelligence quotient, because IQ adapts and grows based on generational qualities, and the life of high stimuli that we have today, compared to 50 years ago or even 100 years ago. And therefore, I think it's difficult that there can be a devolution. Today, the internet platforms and information technology have put us in contact with that which exists continuously, 24 hours a day, with immediate knowledge, which, up until 10 years ago, was unimaginable. We have entered the scientific era, and this is an era that has reduced old experiences to zero. A new era has begun, a completely new era, and therefore we can only go forward with awareness, with perhaps a hope that things can change. But it is an unrealizable hope. From birth, human beings are part of a very complex dynamic, already in its nature, both physical and organizational, social and cognitive. As we grow, we find ourselves faced with certain dynamics that are not only complex but inhumane, in quotation marks, up to the point of causing clashes between nations, and we witness clashes between nations and between nations and governments, which not only disagree on a political administrative level, but which also even lead to wars. This is against nature. How does a simple individual, an individual who is born, lives, learns, and finds himself faced with this torment of humanity, which is ab eternal, this torment, this conflict? And we ask ourselves, when does this conflict end? Since we were talking about predisposition, let's remember instincts, our instinct of aggression, which is natural to man. Now this is probably just a demonstration, it shouldn't be a justification. And so when will the human being get out of this psychological impact? As humans are beginning to look beyond the Earth, outside our own planet, we are experiencing very, very strong realities. Billions and billions, not only of stars that were only commented on until recently, but universes, galaxies. So the infinite becomes an extremely impactful situation in which the human being, revisited in his small way, in his dimension of knowledge, has to face, because each individual has a certain life experience in his evolutionary phase, up to the point of realizing, when he can, his values, his aspirations, and so on, the same way that social norms are then dictated. And these norms then vary from continent to continent, from people to people, and therefore I feel I have to say norms specifically both on predisposition and the impact on the individual since birth. Many people tell us, man is born crying, he dies crying, and he lives crying even during moments of happiness. So crying is a fundamental genetic expression that gives us signals. It tells us that something is wrong with the structure of the planet. As for Europe, alas, which remains a sore point, excluding France and Great Britain, which a few years ago opened up a crack in their archives, showing several UFO sightings and some, we can say, UFO files that are absolutely interesting. But I am convinced that they always show us the tip of the iceberg. Probably the rest remains secret. It isn't the time to let us know everything yet. As far as Europe in general, let's say, we are quite behind the United States. Even if in Edinburgh, for example, about 10 years ago, there was even talk in the university environment, and work was done regarding ufology, as well as in Turkey and in other countries. However, regarding Europe, there is much less attention to the UFO phenomenon. So, I believe, as far as the university world is concerned, which very often tends to put ufology in a corner, we are rather behind, and we are not yet ready to address these issues. While in the United States, due to the sensitivity I mentioned earlier, we are far ahead of the UFO phenomenon. The existence of aliens presupposes, above all, what we said before: supersonic technology to which we should slowly adapt. Therefore, it will take many centuries, not years, not decades, and above all, a forma mentis that changes totally, cognitive logic that changes. On the other hand, I will open and close a parenthesis on Kardashev, who gives us this solemnity of the difference of civilizations, of the potential of civilizations, in which he hypothesizes 7, 8 or 10 categories, through which he highlights exclusively how they differ in evolution with respect to the energy they produce, how they develop their own energy, and how they use it. First through the use of one's own star, then the transversal system of travel up to the energy of the galaxy. So civilization 0 is defined as a function of energy and the quality of its transfer. Although there would be another parameter that should be created, a quality scale. Once the evolutionary force of billions of years of these civilizations has been established, it would also be necessary to establish the quality of life of the civilization and its quotient of logic of deduction and relational life, parameters that we currently do not consider. So when established that if they were to arrive here, and we have already said that these extraterrestrials have been here from the beginning, since the first man set foot on Earth, if they were to manifest themselves, certainly they are always and in any case civilizations of solidarity, but that if they put their reality into contact, their identity with ours, we would come, based on your correct question, we would come to not recognize each other. Realizing this, for individuals who are able to reach a level of meditation, dare I say, daily, might be easier. But then there is another external aspect, which is linked to the life of relationships between peoples, to the conditions in which peoples find themselves. An example is the Pope who went to Africa yesterday, in recent days. The Christian religion has been producing missionary spirit for 400 years, 500 years. Yet, worse than before, we have hunger and desperation. We cannot understand why these peoples are unable to evolve into a positive situation in which everyone is happy. And here I close the parentheses. So at this point we become self-critical. We realize that we have a broken reality, whatever anyone says. And that could be a reason why we don't have contact. So, what can we say at this point? Already today, that we live in a simulated, in a pre-futurized feedback. We have this specific backwards feedback, I dare say even a pre-futurized feedback, which places us in a space-time X, which gives us a hypothesis. So, tomorrow, or even in 100 years, we could also say that we will be capable, as mankind, of being able to change. But there is a lot of talk about globalization. There is a lot of talk about major international events, such as the UN institutions, UNESCO, and so on, that are trying to get the nations back on track. But they are not reaching their goal. Neither thanks to technology, nor, unfortunately, for so many events. Lots of negative events that every nation freely exposes, sometimes even through dictatorships, and we know how they ended up. Therefore, not recognizing ourselves anymore is automatic. Let's put ourselves in a pre-futurized feedback, and we will also understand from a psychological point of view why we are not well, and probably the human race will never be well, both for the questions of instinct, let's say, of a genetic component, but also because the circumstances get tangled up and lead us into endless conflicts. There will be no end of conflict on this earth, probably in the next 300 to 400 years. There are some statistics that say finally aliens could manifest themselves in the 2030s. First we said in 2000, 2012, then in the 2030s. It could even be at the end of the century. I personally deduce around 2300. It's just my let's say, consideration, unjust or just consideration. So right now we don't recognize ourselves. Why we didn't go in another direction is probably not explainable. Going back in time, the connection between religion and UFOs becomes essential. Given that the human being in its infancy, and this is a hypothesis that I deal with in the 5th chapter of my book, which does not disavow nor leans into a situation that denies religious phenomenology. Rather, it enforces it. At the beginning, man's knowledge was very limited. If we assume that an extraterrestrial civilization was given charge of the creation, to the immersion on our planet of Adam, understood as the first man, there is also the hypothesis of polygenesis, therefore it cannot be said that there was only monogenesis. So much so that at one point Cain, when he is driven out because he killed Abel, complains and says, "Are you sending me away? But where am I going to go? That where I am going, I could be received in a bad way." So Cain indirectly admits that there were already other civilizations. Other points of reference. So, in the beginning, the immanent is something that you see coming in an intense way, like, for example, the landing of an aerospatial vehicle, but inevitably also the contact that the higher being could have had with us. In fact, for example, following historical logic, the Sumerians say that they were taught how to cultivate the land, how to build things, how to do one thing instead of another. So it was inevitable that this opportunity would arise. However, it is also true that the mythology presented in our elementary school textbooks, it may not be mythology, because we are told, and it is said, that the priest was the go-between, the bridge between the god, who we must always hypothesize as an extraterrestrial, and the king. In short, the priest acted as a go-between to give assignments and give demonstrations on what to do, and also dictating the laws of minimum coexistence. And this may not even be mythology. On the other hand, it can be explained, and today we can understand it better, that the extraterrestrials were concerned, always hypothetically, not to create radiation problems, and therefore they took a person as a scapegoat. In this case it was the priest, who came also, in quotes, polluted with radiation, and later conveyed the news to the king that he was to command the people. I also have to say that in parallel there is a supreme being, and extraterrestrials also tell us this. A supreme being understood as a creative force, a force to which we all refer. And this has been interpreted, even by monotheistic religions, and was based on what the requirement of the superior being was. Because when a supreme god must be in contact with matter, how does he do it? He has to use angels, archangels, thrones, dominations, and so on. Otherwise, how would he do it? He can only do it through material entities. So it was for this reason I said that in the end religion and ufology will be reconciled, because it was inevitable that these extraterrestrials from another dimension would show themselves in a material dimension. Otherwise, how could the contact have happened? And on the other hand, how could it happen that they understood certain situations? There are some who even hypothesize that man reasoned in telepathic terms right from the beginning, and then gradually, being in matter, in this casing, he lost this ability. Therefore, for us it is difficult to perform telepathic communications. So we can say that on the one hand, mythology clarifies some aspects for us, and on the other, we cannot say that just because there are other extraterrestrial civilizations, the creator God cannot exist, the primary essence, that which our monotheistic religions have been telling us for some time. Moreover, what would have been the most appropriate means to sensitize populations to empathy, friendship between peoples, brotherhood? There were no other ways than to demonstrate these concepts. In the Bible, there are about 250 quotes that talk about contact, extraterrestrial contact, and they are very clear. One of them is Ezekiel and the other is Moses. I would just like to cite these two examples, but we could talk about them later. We cannot fail to trust the study, even in the details, without contesting the translations, as often happens, this phenomenon of contact between king and priest pontifex through a bridge or middleman and superior being, understood as an extraterrestrial civilization, but which is also a materialization of the Supreme Being itself. And one last thing on feedback regarding this question. If the extraterrestrial civilization X, or an alliance with it, has been present on planet Earth since the beginning, ab origine, and has followed the human race over time, I wonder why today it couldn't be the same thing. In the sense that, through the centuries, it has always been present, and still today we ask ourselves, aren't they still in contact with our supreme governmental realities? If they have been in the past, they will be forever. So through this, we enter other fields of discussions, of hypotheses, of analysis, which leave us many openings on possibilities, ideas, and therefore, analogously to the past, these events could repeat themselves, as well as from the remote past, to the near past, present, and future. Ezekiel's testimony is important for anyone who wants to understand the hypothesis, which is described literally. Ezekiel was in the desert, in exile in Babylon. And describes his close encounter with this vehicle that lands and gives life to the event that he describes in detail. So much so that a NASA scientist, in rereading and going over the description, was able to safely argue that he was talking about a sophisticated aerial vehicle, like the ones we have today that travel to the moon. What charges this testimony is the emotion he has of this event, of this phenomenon, which he then somehow connects and associates with his God who manifests himself. But in this case, we have his God who manifests himself on one side, and we have the earthling who is contacted for a reason, let's say perhaps unknown. And the description that Ezekiel makes from an emotional point of view is very interesting, and often this story needs to be revisited according to the emotions that Ezekiel feels. so much so that in the end he will suffer consequences from this situation. He will suffer very striking somatized stress. The same thing happened to another prophet, Daniel, but there it is a whole other matter, and he describes it in a much more objective way. And then there is Moses, who, for a whole book of the Old Testament, contacts Yahweh, contacts his God, because Moses acted as a go-between. And here it is important to underline that it was recommended that only he could approach the location, and therefore the situation and the means that these entities used. And this reason can be easily associated today being linked to radiation, and therefore what could have happened. So much so that he was told he should clean his clothes after the meeting. Now, in religious terms, this is interpreted as a purification, which is not only of the clothes, but also of one's spirituality. But in literary terms, there can be no doubt that there was this close, direct contact. In fact, only one other person approached with Moses together, only a few times, and it is written that he was recommended to clean his clothes, because his clothes had to be cleaned. But the most suggestive part, let's say, about Moses is when he asks, "Sir, show yourself. I want to see your glory." When he says glory, he means his reality, his power. And finally, the Lord says, "Okay," as if he's a little annoyed, "don't worry, you can see me, but you won't be able to see my face, because anyone who would see it would die. Get behind that rock. I will pass, and with my hand I will protect you." And that is what happened. Moses hid behind the rock. The hand described by God was probably an arm of the vehicle that protected from radiation, and he, Moses, was able to see the power of God only from the side and behind. These are interesting concepts, where the divine and the human merge, and where one enters the material dimension from the dimension that we sometimes consider spiritual. And these are episodes that count in ancient ufology. They count not so much for making a distinction between UFOs and religions, but for bringing the two things together, as they live a very, very concrete and, let's say, tangible reality that has nothing to do with the separation of the two. This is important, and I wanted to tell of these two episodes which struck me in my research and which may also lead to other talking points. Then, as we reach our own times, retracing this path, this religious vein, with many others who bear witness to this research. For example, through the construction of these large telescopes on behalf of the Vatican in the United States, the so-called Lucifer. Because there is always this desire to know, beyond our own space, and there are probably institutions that know much more in depth what common knowledge could be. When we talk about UFOs, and this is an aside, we mustn't say "I believe in UFOs", because it's not a faith. It's one thing to say "I believe this phenomenon is real", and another to say "I believe in UFOs", which is something completely different. Having said that, these concepts already give an aura of mystery to ufology, because they actually sometimes seem paranormal phenomena. But I would keep them distinct from paranormal phenomena. So if ufology is given the dignity of science, because ufology embraces many subjects, as I have said on other occasions, chemistry, physics, optics, astronomy, aerodynamics, which means it's a complete subject. So we need to remove, as the United States government seems to be doing, this stigma, this air of condescension that science has towards the matter. Remember that there have been many fine scientists, such as Hynek himself, who was a great astronomer, a consultant of Project Blue Book, and who eventually changed his mind about the UFO phenomenon over time. And effectively, regarding the matter of UFOs, many say that it is a real phenomenon. It is necessary to study it thoroughly, to remove it from this fairy tale-like aura of disbelief, of derision, in order to effectively bring it to a scientific dignity. Therefore, setting up a university faculty would be the best way to remove this subject from the hands of so many improvised ufologists, which in the end, due to their way of operating, only discredits the phenomenon. It should be offered to prepared centres such as ours, or other ufological centres, or other serious researchers. We hope that UFO phenomenology can enter schools, especially because, and bear this in mind, ufology, as well as being a very complex and a very delicate subject, is open to everybody. But not everyone can just jump right in and discuss it like it's something simple. Because, as in all things of human life, an individual's evolutionary phase starts from school, elementary, middle, high school, university, and specialization. I don't understand why, in this field, which is a fairly complex subject, a person who has not followed an informative path, such as studying it at school, can discuss things he knows nothing about. Therefore, this is precisely the commitment that we ask for, that it is possible to have an institutional and scholastic setting in order to start from the basics, and then continue up to having formidable levels of preparation